The rusted swing creaked in the windless night, its chains grinding against metal with a sound like grinding bones. The abandoned playground sat in the heart of Millbrook, a festering wound in the suburban landscape where children once laughed and played before the incident 20 years ago. Now, weeds choked the monkey bars, and the slide bore stains that looked disturbingly like dried blood in the moonlight. Detective Sarachan stepped through the gap in the chain-link fence, her flashlight cutting through the oppressive darkness. 3 missing children in 2 weeks, all last seen near this cursed place. The locals whispered about it in hushed tones, crossing themselves when they passed the rusted gates. They called it cursed ground, a place where innocents went to die. The beam of her light swept across the sandbox, revealing small handprints pressed into the sand, too many handprints, far more than 3 children could have made. Some looked fresh, others seemed ancient, as if they'd been there since the playground's construction. A chill ran down her spine as she noticed they were all the same size, all belonging to children around 6 years old. Behind her, something giggled. She spun around, heart hammering against her ribs. The sound had been unmistakably that of a child, but the playground stretched empty before her. Only shadows danced between the equipment, shifting and writhing like living things. The giggle came again, this time from her left, near the merry-go-round that hadn't turned in decades. "Hello," she called out, her voice swallowed by the unnatural silence. "Police. If someone's there, please come out." The merry-go-round began to turn. Slowly at first, just a gentle rotation that could have been explained by wind, if there had been any wind. But it picked up speed, the rusted metal shrieking in protest as it spun faster and faster. The painted horses, their eyes long since scratched out by vandals, seemed to watch her as they whirled past in a blur of chipped paint and decay. Then she saw them. Children sat astride the horses, their forms translucent and shimmering like heat mirages. They wore clothes from different eras, a girl in a 1950s dress, a boy in overalls from the Depression, another in modern jeans and sneakers. Their faces were pale as moonlight, their eyes black holes that seemed to drink in the darkness around them. And they were all laughing, a sound like breaking glass that made her teeth ache. The merry-go-round stopped with a violent jerk. In the sudden silence, she could hear her own ragged breathing and the frantic beating of her heart. The ghostly children were gone, but their laughter still echoed in her ears. She took a step backward, then another, her rational mind screaming that this was impossible, that stress and lack of sleep were making her hallucinate. That's when she noticed the footprints. Small bare feet had left impressions in the dirt around the merry-go-round, dozens of them, all leading away from the ride and converging on a single point, the old maintenance shed at the far end of the playground. The building leaned at an impossible angle, its roof partially collapsed, its windows boarded up with rotting plywood. She followed the trail, each step feeling like a descent into hell itself. The footprints were fresh, the dirt still damp from tiny toes that had pressed into the earth moments before. But that was impossible. She'd been watching the playground the entire time, and no living children had been here. The shed's door hung open, revealing only impenetrable darkness beyond. A smell wafted out, sweet and cloying, like flowers left too long in a vase, mixed with something else, something that made her stomach turn. The stench of decay, of things that should have been buried long ago. From inside the shed came a new sound. Not laughter this time, but whispers. Dozens of young voices speaking in unison, their words too soft to understand but filled with an urgency that made her skin crawl. They were calling to her, beckoning her forward into the darkness where no light could penetrate. She raised her flashlight, but the beam seemed to die just inches from the doorway, swallowed by shadows that moved with purpose and malice. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and she realized with growing horror that she could almost make out what they were saying. "Come play with us. Come play forever." Her hand trembling, she reached for her radio to call for backup. But as her fingers closed around the device, every light in the surrounding neighborhood went out simultaneously, plunging the world into absolute darkness. In that moment of blindness, she felt small hands grab her ankles. And then she was falling, tumbling forward into the shed, into the waiting arms of children who had been playing the same game for far too long. The last thing she heard before the darkness claimed her was the sound of the playground coming alive, swings creaking, slides groaning, and the merry-go-round beginning its eternal spin once more. Above ground, her flashlight lay abandoned in the dirt, its beam flickering once before dying completely, leaving only the sound of children's laughter echoing through the night. The search team found Detective Chen's car at dawn, doors open, engine still running, radio crackling with unanswered calls. Her flashlight lay in the dirt beside the maintenance shed, its lens cracked like a spider's web. But of Chen herself, there was no trace, only small footprints leading from the shed to the playground equipment, then vanishing entirely as if she had simply dissolved into the morning mist. Captain Rodriguez stood at the fence line, watching his forensics team work the scene with growing unease. 23 years on the force, and he'd never seen anything like this. For missing persons now, all connected to this godforsaken place. The brass wanted answers, the media was circling like vultures, and the town council was breathing down his neck to close the case quickly and quietly. But Rodriguez knew better than to rush into the playground during daylight hours. The locals had warned him about the rules: never go alone, never go at night, and never, ever respond to the children's calls. Old Mrs. Kowalski, who lived across the street, had been watching the playground for decades. She claimed the spirits were strongest when the sun went down, but even in broad daylight, sensitive people could feel their presence. "Captain," Officer Martinez called from near the swing set. "You need to see this." Rodriguez ducked under the crime scene tape and approached the rusted swings. Martinez pointed to the seats, his face pale despite the morning sun. Each swing bore the impression of a small body, the metal worn smooth in the exact shape of a child's form. But these weren't normal wear patterns, they were too deep, too precise, as if the metal had been molded by countless hours of use. "Sir, according to city records, this playground was condemned and closed 20 years ago after the incident. No one's supposed to have been using these swings since then." Rodriguez ran his fingers along one of the impressions, feeling the unnatural smoothness of the metal. It was warm to the touch, despite the cool morning air. "What incident?" "I don't remember any reports from 20 years ago." Martinez consulted his tablet, scrolling through archived files. "Halloween night, 1984. 7 children went missing during a neighborhood party. They were found 3 days later in the maintenance shed, all of them." He paused, swallowing hard. "All of them appeared to have died of fright. No signs of violence, no evidence of foul play. The coroner said their hearts just stopped, like they'd been scared to death." A chill ran down Rodriguez's spine that had nothing to do with the October air. "And the playground was closed after that?" "Immediately. The city council voted unanimously to condemn the property, but somehow it was never demolished. Every contractor who bid on the job either backed out or suffered mysterious accidents. Eventually, everyone just forgot about it." Rodriguez studied the playground with new eyes. The equipment looked far older than 20 years of abandonment could account for. The metal was corroded beyond recognition, the paint had long since peeled away, and weeds grew through cracks in the asphalt that seemed to form deliberate patterns, almost like symbols or runes. "Captain!" Another officer's voice cut through the morning air, sharp with panic. "We found something in the shed." They hurried to the maintenance building, where Officer Thompson stood frozen in the doorway, his face white as chalk. He pointed into the darkness with a shaking hand. "I was checking for evidence of Detective Chen, and I found this." Rodriguez peered into the shed, his eyes adjusting to the gloom. The interior was larger than it should have been, stretching back into shadows that seemed to swallow his flashlight beam. But it wasn't the impossible dimensions that made his blood run cold, it was the toys. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, scattered across the floor in neat piles. Dolls with missing eyes, toy cars with their wheels torn off, stuffed animals with their stuffing spilling out like entrails. All of them old, some dating back decades, all of them bearing the unmistakable signs of having been loved by children who were no longer alive to play with them. And in the center of it all sat Detective Chen's badge, polished to a mirror shine despite having been missing for less than 12 hours. "Nobody goes in there," Rodriguez ordered, backing away from the doorway. seal it off and call the state police. This is beyond our jurisdiction now." But as he spoke, a sound drifted from the depths of the shed, the soft patter of running feet, dozens of them, moving in perfect synchronization. The toys began to shift and rustle, as if invisible hands were sorting through them, selecting favorites for a game that would never end. Rodriguez grabbed his radio, but before he could speak, every electronic device in the area died simultaneously. Cell phones, radios, even the digital cameras, all of them went dark as if drained by some unseen force. In the sudden silence, they could hear something else, the distant sound of children singing a nursery rhyme, their voices sweet and innocent and absolutely terrifying. "Ring around the rosy, pocket full of posies, ashes, ashes, we all fall down." The singing grew louder, closer, and Rodriguez realized with mounting horror that it was coming from beneath their feet. The playground had been built over something, some older foundation that the city records had conveniently forgotten to mention. And whatever was down there had been waiting patiently for new playmates. The ground beneath the merry-go-round began to crack, dark soil pushing up through the asphalt like fingers clawing their way to the surface. The singing reached a crescendo, and suddenly every piece of playground equipment began to move at once, swings swaying, slides groaning, the merry-go-round spinning faster and faster until its rusted horses seemed to gallop through the air. Rodriguez and his team ran for the fence, but as they reached the gate, it slammed shut with a sound like thunder. The chain link began to grow, stretching upward and inward, forming a dome over the playground. They were trapped inside with whatever was rising from beneath the earth. The last thing Rodriguez saw before the world went black was a small hand reaching up through the cracked asphalt, followed by another, then another, until dozens of pale arms were clawing their way into the daylight, ready to welcome their new friends to a game that would last forever. The military cordoned off 6 city blocks around the playground by nightfall, their black vehicles forming an impenetrable perimeter that kept both media and civilians at bay. Dr. Elena Vasquez stepped out of the unmarked van, her paranormal investigation equipment weighing heavy in her hands. 20 years of studying supernatural phenomena had prepared her for many things, but the readings her instruments were picking up defied every scientific principle she knew. The electromagnetic field around the playground pulsed like a living heartbeat, and her thermal cameras showed impossible heat signatures, dozens of small forms moving beneath the earth in patterns that suggested intelligence, purpose, and an ancient hunger that had been feeding for far longer than anyone suspected. "Doctor, we've lost contact with the entire police unit," Colonel Hayes briefed her as they approached the fence line. 17 officers went dark simultaneously at 0900 hours. Satellite imagery shows the playground is different now. Through her night vision scope, Vasquez could see what he meant. The playground equipment had rearranged itself into a perfect circle, like some primitive ritual site. The swings hung motionless despite the wind, the slide had somehow twisted into an impossible spiral that hurt to look at, and the merry-go-round spun silently in the center, its horses now facing inward as if watching something in the middle of their eternal dance. But it was the ground that made her breath catch in her throat. The asphalt had been torn apart from below, revealing a network of tunnels that glowed with a sickly phosphorescent light. The excavation was too precise, too organized to be natural. Something had been digging up from deep underground, following blueprints that predated human civilization. The geological surveys show this area was built over a Native American burial ground, she told the colonel, consulting her research files. But not just any burial ground, this was a place where they buried children who died of unexplained illnesses, children they believed had been touched by malevolent spirits. Her EMF detector began screaming as they moved closer to the fence. The readings were off the charts, indicating spiritual activity so intense it was creating its own electromagnetic storm. Through the chain link, she could see small figures moving in the tunnels below, not quite solid, not quite transparent, but something in between that made her eyes water to focus on. "Doctor," Hayes whispered, his voice tight with barely controlled fear. "Look at the shed." The maintenance building had transformed into something that belonged in a nightmare. Its walls had stretched and warped, growing upward into a twisted spire that pierced the night sky like a black needle. Windows had appeared where none existed before, and through them, she could see the missing officers and Detective Chen, all of them sitting in perfect rows like students in some hellish classroom. They were alive, but wrong. Their eyes had turned completely black, and they sat with the unnatural stillness of marionettes waiting for their strings to be pulled. Occasionally, one would turn their head in perfect unison with the others, tracking movement that only they could see. They're being prepared, Vasquez realized with growing horror. The spirits aren't just collecting people, they're converting them, turning them into something else. Her thermal camera picked up new movement in the tunnels. The ghostly children were emerging, dozens of them, their forms becoming more solid as they climbed toward the surface. But these weren't the innocent spirits of dead children, they were something far older and more malevolent, entities that had been masquerading as human children for centuries, feeding on fear and innocence until they grew strong enough to break free from their underground prison. The first one emerged near the swing set, its form solidifying as it touched the surface. It looked like a normal 6-year-old girl, except for its eyes, ancient, knowing, filled with a hunger that had been growing for millennia. It smiled at Vasquez through the fence, and she felt her sanity begin to fray at the edges. More children followed, each one taking on the appearance of a different era: Victorian dress, Depression-era overalls, 1950s school clothes, modern jeans, and sneakers. They were wearing the faces of every child who had ever gone missing in this town, stolen identities that they wore like masks to lure new victims into their web. "They're not ghosts," Vasquez whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of her own racing heartbeat. "There's something else, something that's been pretending to be human children for so long they've forgotten what they really are." The entities began to sing, their voices harmonizing in a melody that predated human language. The sound bypassed her ears entirely, resonating directly in her bones, in her blood, in the primitive part of her brain that still remembered when humanity huddled around fires to keep the darkness at bay. The fence began to dissolve. Not rust or decay, but actual dissolution, the metal simply ceasing to exist as if it had never been there at all. The barrier between the playground and the outside world was disappearing, and soon these ancient predators would be free to hunt in a world that had forgotten how to protect itself from the things that lived in the spaces between reality. "Fall back!" Hayes shouted, but his voice sounded distant and distorted, as if it was coming from underwater. "All units, fall back to secondary perimeter." But it was too late. The children were already spreading out, their forms becoming more solid with each step they took on unconsecrated ground. They moved with purpose, heading toward the residential areas where real children lay sleeping in their beds, unaware that their nightmares were about to become reality. Vasquez tried to run, but her legs felt like lead. The singing had gotten inside her head, rewriting her neural pathways, turning her own thoughts against her. She could feel her adult mind being stripped away layer by layer, leaving behind only the terrified child she had once been, the child who had always known that monsters were real and that they were always hungry. The last thing she saw before the darkness claimed her was one of the entities approaching, wearing the face of her own daughter who had died in a car accident 3 years ago. It smiled with her daughter's mouth and spoke with her daughter's voice, but the words that came out were older than civilization itself. "Come play with us, Mommy. Come play forever and ever and ever." Behind her, the military perimeter was collapsing as soldiers found themselves unable to fire on what appeared to be innocent children, even as those children reached out with hands that ended in claws and open mouths that revealed rows of needle-sharp teeth designed for feeding on human fear. The evacuation sirens wailed across 3 counties as the entities spread beyond the playground's boundaries, their influence growing exponentially with each mile they traveled from their ancient prison. Dr. Vasquez found herself standing in what remained of the military command post, her mind somehow her own again, watching through satellite feeds as the creatures moved through suburban neighborhoods like a plague of innocence corrupted. But something had changed in her during those moments of possession. She could see them now for what they truly were, not ghosts or demons, but something far older, a species that had evolved alongside humanity in the dark spaces between dimensions, feeding on the one emotion that transcended all others, a parent's love for their child. "They're not random," she told the emergency response team, her voice hoarse from screaming. "Every missing child, every disappearance over the past century, They've been building to this moment. They needed enough human essence, enough stolen innocence, to break free from whatever was keeping them contained underground. General Morrison studied the tactical displays with growing desperation. Our weapons are useless. Every time our soldiers get close, they see their own children, their siblings, their younger selves. How do you fight something that turns your love against you? Through the monitors, they watched the entities enter homes with impossible ease, passing through walls like smoke, appearing in children's bedrooms as beloved friends or family members. But instead of harming the children directly, they were doing something worse. They were replacing them, one by one, taking their forms and sending the real children somewhere else, somewhere that existed in the spaces between heartbeats. Vasquez's equipment detected massive dimensional rifts opening throughout the affected area. The playground had become a nexus point, a doorway between realities that was growing wider with each successful replacement. Soon, the barrier between dimensions would collapse entirely, and these creatures would have access to every child on Earth. There has to be a way to stop them, she muttered, reviewing her research frantically. Every supernatural entity has rules, limitations, something that binds them to. She stopped, her blood turning to ice as she found the answer buried in her files. The Native American burial records spoke of a ritual, a way to seal the entities away forever. But it required a sacrifice. Someone had to willingly enter their realm and close the doorway from the inside, trapping themselves with the creatures for eternity. Doctor, we're getting reports of reality distortions spreading to major population centers, Morrison announced. Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, children are disappearing and being replaced faster than we can track. At this rate, we'll lose the entire Midwest by dawn. Vasquez looked at the playground through the satellite feed. The twisted spire that had once been the maintenance shed was now a towering monument of impossible geometry, its peak disappearing into dimensions that human eyes couldn't perceive. At its base, she could see the missing officers and Detective Chen, still sitting in their perfect rows, but their purpose was becoming clear. They were anchors, human souls keeping the doorway stable while the entities completed their invasion. I know how to stop them, she said quietly. But someone has to go back in there, back to the source. Someone has to close the doorway from the other side. The command center fell silent except for the constant stream of emergency reports flooding in from across the region. Everyone understood what she was saying, what she was volunteering to do. It was a suicide mission with no possibility of rescue or return. Doctor, there has to be another way. There isn't. She was already gathering her equipment, loading it with every piece of technology that might help her survive long enough to complete the ritual. The entities are using the playground as their anchor point in our reality. If I can disrupt that connection, sever their link to our dimension, they'll be pulled back to wherever they came from. She paused at the command post exit, looking back at the screens showing the spreading chaos. In one monitor, she could see a suburban street where every house now contained one of the creatures wearing a child's face, waiting for their parents to come home from work. In another, a school playground where dozens of the entities played on swings and slides, their laughter echoing across dimensions as they prepared for the next phase of their invasion. If I don't make it back, she told Morrison, nuke the site. Don't hesitate, don't try to save anyone. Just burn it all and hope the radiation disrupts whatever dimensional physics they're using. The journey back to the playground felt like descending into the heart of madness itself. Reality became increasingly unstable the closer she got, with buildings aging decades and seconds, trees growing backward into seeds, and the sky flickering between day and night as if time itself was breaking down. The playground was unrecognizable now, transformed into a vast amphitheater of twisted metal and impossible architecture. The entities had gathered in the center, hundreds of them, all wearing the faces of missing children from across the centuries. They turned to watch her approach, their ancient eyes gleaming with anticipation. At the center of their circle sat Detective Chen, but she was different now, older, wiser, her eyes holding knowledge that no human should possess. She smiled as Vasquez approached, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of eons. You understand now, Chen said, though her lips barely moved. We are not invaders. We are gardeners, and humanity is our crop. We have been cultivating you for millennia, waiting for you to grow numerous enough, emotional enough, to sustain us properly. Vasquez activated her equipment, feeling the dimensional energy swirling around her like a hurricane of pure malevolence. The ritual required her to reach the exact center of the nexus point, where the barriers between realities were thinnest. But the entities weren't going to let her reach it easily. They began to change, dropping their human disguises and revealing their true forms, writhing masses of shadow and hunger that existed in too many dimensions for human perception to fully grasp. They reached for her with appendages that weren't quite tentacles, weren't quite claws, but something that bypassed physical reality entirely and grasped directly at her soul. Fighting through waves of existential terror, she reached the center of the playground where the original merry-go-round still spun, now revealed as an ancient ritual circle carved with symbols that predated human civilization. This was where it had all begun, where the first doorway had been opened by people who thought they were burying their dead but were actually feeding something that should have remained forever sealed away. With her last conscious thought, she activated the dimensional disruptor and spoke the words she had found in the Native American records, words that had been passed down through generations as a warning and a weapon. The playground began to collapse in on itself, reality folding like origami as the doorway between dimensions snapped shut with the force of a cosmic thunderclap. The entity's screams echoed across multiple realities as they were pulled back into their prison, taking with them everyone they had claimed, the missing children, the police officers, Detective Chen, and Dr. Vasquez herself. The playground imploded into a singularity of pure darkness, then vanished entirely, leaving only an empty lot where grass would never grow again. In the aftermath, the replaced children returned to their homes with no memory of what had happened, and the world forgot about the playground that had never officially existed. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is still, people living near that empty lot can hear the distant sound of children playing, and they know enough to keep their own children inside until dawn. The gardeners are patient. They have been waiting for millennia, and they can wait a little longer. Thanks a lot for watching this video. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more content like this. Also, share this video with your friends, it really helps a lot. Raising hands. If I made any mistake in the video, I sincerely apologize. Feel free to correct me in the comments. And let me know in the comments, what should I improve in future videos? Your feedback means a lot. Speech balloon. See you in the next one, take care and keep learning.